This lunchtime, high tides and heavy rain bring floods to the west. In Gloucestershire, floodplains are overwhelmed with water as rivers burst their banks. In Bristol, city centre streets are flooded for the first time in years. And heavy seas batter the Somerset coastline, leaving damage and debris in their wake. Heavy rain and exceptionally high tides have brought flooding to the West Country once again. Gloucestershire, Somerset and Dorset took a battering from heavy seas and floodplains vanished underwater as rivers burst their banks. In Bristol, city centre streets were flooded and commuter routes closed. We'll be hearing from Scott Ellis in Bristol in a few moments. But first we can join Steve Nibbs in Gloucestershire. Steve, what's the situation there now?
Windy, rainy, but all is calm at the moment. It was a very different picture around 9 o'clock this morning, Emma, because we had that tidal surge, that 7 bore coming up the river behind me, and it caused huge problems. The river rose really quickly. Just have a look down here. You can see the decking was stood on. About 9:30 this morning, we couldn't have stood here because the water was rising so quickly. It came up about 12, 13 feet in about 45 minutes. Caused flooding to properties either side. We are in an area that had a severe flood warning last night. And although only a handful of properties got flooded, it was still very close for many.
The famous 7 bore made a slow approach, but with the river already very swollen, the tidal surge hit hard.
What's staggering is how quickly the river has risen here. The bore came in at around 20 to 9 this morning. It's just over an hour later, and it's at least 10 to 12 foot above where it was when the bore came in, and it's still rising, expected to peak in the next 15 minutes.
Within minutes, the water broke over the riverbank, this force of nature finding a way through wherever it could. Minsterworth was already on a severe flood warning, and people had done what they could to protect their homes, but for some, it wasn't enough.
It's 2 levels in the house. It was about 18 inches in one part and about 3 or 4 inches in the other. So
it came in quite steep as well.
It did. Yeah, it was really flowing over there. It was. It was quite something. It was like it really was a tide coming over the bank. It was.
For others, they were just high enough to escape.
We had fair warning from the Environment Agency that it was going to come up very, very high. So we thought, well, we'll just do what we can to keep it out of the house.
At the 7 bore inn, usually a spot to sightsee the bore, the carpets and furniture had been taken up in readiness, and the water did come close.
It's worrying. We've got all our sandbags ready, just in case, but it's, we've never seen anything like this before.
As the bore moved on, the Coast Guard moved along the stretch of the river too, checking that no one had been trapped or injured.
People are responding very well to the warnings. They've been receiving the warnings from the Environment Agency, which they can register for, and people are responding well to our requests to move back from the water, which is very fast moving.
As fast as the water arrived, in Minsterworth it quickly went away, but in many other areas it's still there, and another bore, albeit slightly lower, is due tomorrow.
Well, to get the latest on the situation, I'm with Dave Throop from the Environment Agency. Dave, we spoke to you on Points West last night. You said it was going to be bad. It was close, wasn't it?
It was very close indeed. You know, right the way along the length here, we were within inches of the top of the flood defences. It was very close, and if it had overtopped, then you know we've been looking at a very different situation.
We were here at Minsterworth all morning. We know that some properties have been flooded here. What's the situation like elsewhere?
We're still trying to assess the damage by this morning's surge. So we're actually going to look at those now, and then we'll watch the surge through again tonight. It looks like it should be slightly lower, but it's still going to be a big tide.
We look at the river behind us. It's extremely swollen as a result of the bore anyway, and all the weather we were talking about.
Exactly, you know, there's a lot of water coming down as well. That's meeting the bore coming up. It is unpredictable, so we certainly need to be on our toes.
Okay, Dave Throop for the moment. Thanks very much indeed. The important thing is if you are in an area that is at risk of flooding, then do keep an eye on the Environment Agency's website. That's environment-agency.gov.uk for the latest, especially with those high tides coming in tonight and tomorrow morning.
Steve Nibbs in Gloucestershire, thank you very much indeed. Well, in Bristol, city centre roads were flooded for the first time in years as the River Avon burst its banks. These scenes from 1968 show the damage caused before modern flood defences were put in place. The City Council says a flood barrier used for the first time last night did its job and protected homes in the area. This report from Scott Ellis.
Bristol at 8 o'clock this morning. Then, against a rising River Avon.
Tide now is we're approaching about 30 minutes away from the critical point. as you can see over there, it's already overlapping the cycle path, so it's going to be very close indeed.
The city deployed its flood barrier for the first time. Without it, houses close to the Avon would flood.
Well, it's quite worrying. Obviously, we've prepared our houses as much as we can. We're glad that we've got this defence here, but obviously it's quite scary. It looks quite dramatic, but if you live here, you know, it's quite worrying.
Half an hour later, roads had to be closed, including the Portway, as the incoming tide raised the River Avon to its highest levels for 15 years. In the Cumberland Basin, water spilled back into the floating harbour.
Well, I've been in Bristol nearly 20 years now, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. You know, to think that that is stopping the water coming into the Bristol docks is just, wow. It's incredible.
The flood barrier did its job, saving homes from floods. It'll stay in place over the weekend. As the tide receded, a sigh of relief. And in Weston-super-Mare, the clear-up of wood, rubbish and seaweed washed in on the morning's high tide.
It's amazing, I've never seen anything like it really. In all the years we've lived here, it's absolutely crazy.
These little big scaling, have you found anything valuable?
Nothing valuable, well, valuable to us.
Lola found a big chocolate like this, but she's making me carry home.
The seafront road in Weston had to close for about an hour, but here, as in Bristol, no serious flooding damage. But there is more high tides, wind and rain to come. Scott Ellis, BBC Points West.